I originally was going to do this video featuring Galactic B heroes, but with set 8 releasing a very important card for them, the Abend Robust, we're actually going to be instead talking about Hexaorb Sorceress. First things first, let's go over Hexaorb Sorceress herself, as she is the main Vanguard for the deck. She has two abilities. When a drive check reveals a trigger unit, choose one of your rear guards and it gets 10k until the end of the turn. This is only rear guard, so you cannot give Hexaorb Sorceress herself this 10k, but if you are boosting with a grade 1 or technically any other unit, you can give that rear guard the power, which then in effect does give Hexaorb the power, so keep that in mind. She has another skill here where once per turn, this is an axe skill. I originally thought you had to do this as soon as your persona ride, but it's an axe skill. And what you do is if you persona roll this turn, you counterblast 1, soul blast 1, reveal up to 1 critical or front from your hand and put it on the top of your deck. You don't have to reveal this because it's up to 1, so you can reveal 0. But putting a trigger or front on top of your deck is nice. And then finally this unit gets drive plus 1 until the end of the turn. As you can tell, just from reading out her abilities here, this deck just focuses on checking triggers and making sure that you can check triggers so that you can power up your rear guards and swing in with huge numbers. For the ride line, it's going to be rather simple. We have the grade 0 Wrinkle Brave. You can play whatever grade 0 you'd like here, it doesn't really matter. We're going to be playing the grade 1 Tier Square Sorceress, and then the grade 2 Pentagleam Sorceress, followed up finally by the Hexaorb Sorceress. I've never used this ride line for Hexaorb. Actually, in all the other videos I've done and used different combinations of ride lines. And this is the first time I'm actually using it, and it works fine. In general, Keter Sanctuary does not have a good pool of ride lines for you to use in your ride deck. And by that I mainly just mean the grades 1 and 2. The only good combinations of this are either Javelin / Marin into Blaster Dark. And that's about it. Everything else does nothing, specifically for Hexaorb Sorceress. And it's mainly the grade 1 that I have an issue with. Pentagleam is fine, but Tier Square is not very great for the deck, I don't think, and I wish that they would give them either something directly for Hexaorb or indirectly that can actually be used in this spot. Tier Square Sorceress here just says when she's rode upon by Pentagleam Sorceress, you can counterblast 1 and draw a card. The counterblast kind of sucks, but it's one of the few ways that this deck ever had to plus. Other than that, she has the rearguard skill where if you drive check a trigger, you can counterblast 1, choose one of your opponent's front row units and put them on the bottom of the deck. So you have some control / removal here, but we don't play any of these in the main deck in this build. Then we have the Pentagleam Sorceress, who has a really nice effect. Both of her effects are actually pretty useful. Her first effect here is when she's rode upon by Hexaorb Sorceress, you can look at the top 3 cards of your deck and arrange them in any order that you'd like. You can't put any of them on the bottom of your deck, so if you just see a bunch of junk, you're kind of stuck with it, but there are some ways in this deck that you can get around and get rid of that junk. When this unit is placed on rearguard circle, you can also look at the top card of your deck and put it on the top or the bottom of your deck, which is pretty nifty. Shows it gets 2k if you put it on the bottom of your deck. But spoiler alert, again, we're not playing any of these in the main deck, only in the ride deck. For the grade 3s, it's going to be super simple. Just 3 copies of your Persona Ride Hexaorb Sorceress. There are a few other grade 3s that you can try. There's a specific 3-card slot in this deck that you can mess around with, which I'll mention later. And you can, if you'd like, you can insert any of these grade 3s. For example, the Fasado is always good. The Resist is great. Counter Charge and Soul Charge is very good. Unfortunately, if you do Soul Charge a trigger that you stacked on top, it is going to be kind of rough, so just keep that in mind, but getting the resources is nice. The Totohe, not really a big fan of her. I've tried her out several different times and she just feels clunky, especially with the counterblast and having to play fronts instead of crits as much. She has the ability that says when a unit attacks and it does a drive check, you can counterblast 1. And if you reveal a trigger, you can, depending on the type of trigger that was revealed during that drive check, you can use the following effects. If it was a critical trigger, you can put one of your opponent's rear guards to the bottom of the deck. And if it was a front trigger, you can then stand one of your grade 2 or less rear guards. So in theory, this is perfect for Hexaorb, but I've just never really been able to use it in practice. Then the last card we have here is Spinning Knight Gwendolyn from set D-BT07. It's a very simple card that just says when this unit attacks, if you Persona Road, you get 5k and your opponent has to use 2 or more cards to guard. So it gives you some guard restrict in Hexaorb. It's not super accessible because you do have to Persona Ride, but Persona Riding, you know, want to do that in Hexaorb, so it does find some sort of place. The grade 2s are actually the bulk of the deck here. We've got ourselves 4 copies of the 4-side Glow Sorceress, 4 copies of the Quadra Cass Sorceress, 4 copies of Octoray Sorceress, and 4 copies of the Exquisite Knight Olwen. 4-side Glow Sorceress here is actually a promo for Hexaorb, and she is one of the cheaper promos that is very good in the deck that she is for, but she has a rather simple ability. In front row, rear circle, she has to be in the front row. If this unit is chosen by your grade 3 or greater Vanguard's ability with Sorceress in its card name, you can Soul Blast 2 and countercharge. And if its attack was increased or decreased by this effect, you can draw a card. So this just lets you get some countercharge as well as some card draw. Another one of the uses for this is also to just clear out some junk that you saw from your top couple of cards. So you can stack it in an order where you check a trigger, and you can then use this to draw one of those other cards that's not a trigger, so then Hexaorb can continue drive checking, hopefully another trigger. Octoray Sorceress is one of the best support cards that Hexaorb has gotten in a long time, and this is from set 6. She has a rather simple ability as well that says when this is placed on a rearguard circle, if you have a grade 3 or greater Sorceress Vanguard, then you can counterblast 1. Look at the top 2 cards from your deck, and you can choose up to 2 of them and put them into your hand. Put everything else on the top of your deck in any order. If you chose 2 cards to put into your hand, you then choose a card from your hand and put it on the bottom of your deck. So you can very easily take 2 cards, add them to your hand, and then either put back something like possibly a trigger, but more than likely one of the top 2 cards you just saw, and put it on the bottom of your deck. You can also just rearrange the top cards of your deck. So it has very good utility in Hexaorb, as you can see. She also has a skill whenever she attacks a Vanguard. If you Persona Ride, she gets 5k. So she gives a nice 15k, making her 25, because you'll be on Persona Ride, to swing into your Vanguard, which is a decent enough number to hit with 1 card alone. Next, we've got Quadra Cass Sorceress, who is also from set 6. This unit says that when it's placed on rearguard circle, if you have a Vanguard with Sorceress in its card name, so you can actually use this on grade 2, possibly even grade 1 if you somehow get her out that way. She says look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put them in any order, and then Soul Charge 1. So this has the upside where you get Soul, and if you look at the top 2 and you see something you want to get rid of so you can hit a trigger, you can Soul Charge it. Likewise, if you use another card to rearrange cards, like maybe the Pentagleam, you can then use this to Soul Charge one of those cards out. However, it has the obvious downside where if you look at the top 2 and it's crit, you're going to lose one of those crits, and there's no way around that. So try to only use this either early game on your Pentagleam turn to try and maybe get some early aggro, and where there are possibly more targets for you to Soul Charge, or use it after you've used one of your other skills and you know that there's junk there. Lastly, for the grade 2s, we have Exquisite Knight Olwen here, who has 2 skills. The first one here says when it's placed on rearguard circle, if you have a Hexaorb Sorceress specifically, you can Soul Blast 1, look at the top 2 cards from the top of your deck, put them on the top of your deck in any order, or put them at the bottom of your deck in any order. So this is the best card when it comes to get rid of junk. When I say junk, I specifically mean anything that is not a trigger on top of your deck, because you want to be able to obviously drive check as many triggers as possible. So you want to make sure that all you have on top of your deck is triggers so that all of your effects can go off. For example, Owen has an ability here that says when you drive check and reveal a trigger unit, you can counterblast 1 and this unit gets 10k until the end of the turn. You can use this as many times as you want, as much the counterblast as you have, because it's not once per turn. Which means Owen is a huge, powerful rearguard that you can use to your disposal. That does it for the grade 2s. Optionally, you can try and play something like the Yearnful Magic Isunu, either as one of the slots here, or in the flex slot in the grade 1s, which we're going to talk about in a bit. She just says if you have either Pentagleam or Hexaorb, you can discard a card, look at the top 2, put them in the top of your deck in any order, or put them at the bottom of your deck in any order, and she gets 10k. So she can be very strong in your grade 2 turn. Of course, discarding does kind of hurt. And finally we have Divine Sister Bernie, who is a card from set 6. Who has a rather simple ability that just says if you have a Vanguard with Sorceress in its card name, you can counterblast 1. Look at the top card of your deck, or rather reveal it. And if it's a normal unit, put it into your hand, and if not, put it back on the top of your deck. So unfortunately, this can either just result into you counterblast 1 to draw, or counterblast 1 to just look at the top card of your deck, which isn't as great, but it's an option that you can use. Finally, for the grade 1s, we got ourselves 4 copies of Little Sage Marin. Got ourselves 4 copies of PGs. We got unit PGs because I do not feel like swapping out the Order PG for my other decks. Either way, you're fine. Your Order PG is obviously a great card, but if you end up playing this, it's not the worst thing in the world because you do want to have some boosters. So having an additional normal unit isn't the worst thing in the world, but if you can, get the Blitz Order. And then finally we have here the Recurring Magic Lalarita, which is actually the flex spot that I've been mentioning. We got 3 copies of this card. For any of the options that I've mentioned throughout this video, you can replace her with any of those cards if you'd like. So this is actually going to be a Little Sage Marin appreciation section here. Little Sage Marin has a very simple skill. The first skill we don't worry about because we're not using it in the right deck. It just says, during your turn on Rearguard Circle, if you have 3 or more units, this unit gets 2k attack. This counts your Vanguard because it says units, not rearguards. So this means that on turn 1, if you play out a Marin and another unit, you can have this be 10k. This makes it so that it basically hits the same numbers as one of your intercepts, but it can also boost for a very good number. For example, you can use this to boost your Hexaorb Sorceress and have her hit for 23k. This puts your opponent in a pretty awkward situation because of the way that boosting works with Hexaorb Sorceress. Your opponent might try to guard a 2 to pass for 23, being something like 48, but that doesn't really matter for Hexaorb Sorceress because she can very easily put any triggers and power she gets onto this Marin here, making it so that that 23 easily becomes 43 just from a single trigger. So with that and triple drive, guarding is very difficult when Hexaorb Sorceress has a booster, and Marin just makes you hit even better numbers at that rate. As I mentioned, we're playing 4 PGs. You can have 4 of these in your deck, and they just say that when you use this to guard, you can choose one of your units and it doesn't get hit for that battle. But if you have 2 or more cards in your hand, you have to discard a card from your hand. Otherwise, you don't have to discard. So if you have just 1 card and you use this to guard, then you don't have to discard, which is kind of nice. And if you have no cards, you can still use this to guard, unlike the Blitz Order PG, which does let you discard, but of course the Blitz Order PG does let you get around a lot of different guard restricts and a lot of special conditions, so it is always good to have 1 copy of those. Finally, we got ourselves here Recurring Magic Lalarita here. This is a card that I think is not very good for Hexaorb at all right now. It's very clunky, but it is the easiest way she has to achieve 4 attacks and possibly a restanding rearguard with a lot of crit and power. She has the skill that says at the end of the battle that your drive check revealed a trigger unit. If you have Hexaorb Sorceress as your Vanguard, counterblast Soul Blast, and also retire this unit, and then you can stand one of your other rearguards. So she has the distinction that unlike Totone, she can stand grade 3s as well. Totone is only grade 2s or less, but nonetheless you can pay this rather large cost in order to get an additional attack, which might sound really good in Hexaorb depending on how your board is set up, but it does require some setup to actually be able to use this, as you might end up using the Counterblast and Soul Blast that you want to use for this card in order to actually ensure that you can get the trigger that you're trying to hit. We're playing 3 of these just because I didn't really know what else to put in the deck. I tried a couple of different options like the Drilling Angel and a couple of the grade 3 options that we went over earlier. I think in general a grade 1 is the best option for this spot, but you can go ahead and mess around with it as much as you'd like. I know a lot of people think of always using this in Hexaorb, but it just feels really clunky. It's also not useful early on and it just uses so much resources. So just keep that in mind. If you can use it, go for it. If not, you don't have to make this the main game plan of the deck, because Hexaorb can hit some pretty good scary numbers without having to restand. We'll go over some options here. We have the Changing Magic Memoru. I would not play this. This skill is not very good. It just says if you have a grade 3 Sorceress, you can retire her, choose a crit or front from your drop and add it to your hand. It's also 7k base. Similar to this card here, this card I'm kind of considering playing just because she says if you have a Sorceress when this unit guards, it gets 10k shield. So you actually have 15k shield throughout the entirety of the game since your whole ride line is Sorceress. So that's pretty good, but of course it is also 7k, so it's not going to be as usable. Then we got another card from set 8 here, which is Divine Sister Palmier. This is unfortunately 6k, so it hits even worse number, but if you were to place this, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, you can counterblast 1, look at the top 3, and put them on the top of your deck in any order. So it basically does what Pentagleam Sorceress does, so you can consider that if that's really a big issue. Of course, if you see cards you don't like, you kind of have to just keep them there. Given that I'm playing a lot of copies of Quadrocast, you can maybe argue that this might not be so bad, but only if you can compensate for the counterblast costs, since, as usual, the biggest issue with Hexaorb Sorceress is her resources, which is why we don't really like playing copies like these, or I should say cards like these from previous sets. The Tortoise is great. It has the dual double-edged sword effect of giving you the Hexaorb Sorceress design you show in case you don't see the best card, but also has the ability of making you lose possible stacks that you had in order to get the Persona Ride. Plus, you can only use her on grade 3, and that means that you can't get the Persona Ride earlier. So if you see this later in the game, you have to wait until next turn to actually be able to use the Persona Ride, which kind of sucks because you might not even make it that far. The Dieglass Sorceress has a nice effect, but the fact that it's so costly in counterblasting and discarding a card just to get some board presence makes her not as feasible. I feel like this card in the future is possibly going to be able to have some use, but as of right now, I find it really costly. So I think one of the best replacements for the La Larita is actually this here, the Knight of Gale Sinburglar. This is a card that has an effect that was released in set 7, and it was given 1 card for each nation, I think except for Brightgate. And it just says, when your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater during your turn, this card gets 5k attack. So it's a 13k booster or attacker. So this hits some pretty good numbers with a lot of your rear guards, but also with Hexaorb Sorceress, you just want to make sure you have rear guards so you can give the power to, since she can't give power to herself. So even if it's just a grade 1, that's still fine. So if you have this with the Marin, you basically have grade 1s that act like grade 2s without intercept. So they hit pretty good numbers. Lastly, we've got our triggers here. We're actually going to be using 7 crits, 4 of the soul crits. I've actually, to be honest, I've never ever played them out and boosted with them. So you can get away with different triggers if you'd like. It'll probably make it easier in case you have to call out a trigger. The numbers might be a little bit better. We're actually going to be playing 4 fronts, just because we have many times I've seen that there's just been 2 rear guards out, and we have just this heavy front row and not a lot of back row, since I don't play a lot of boosters, and they might not always be around, since, for example, the La Larita retires herself, and I'm prioritizing a booster behind Hexaorb. This makes sure that even if you check a critical, it technically acts as a front, so you can give power to 2 units, but this just gives power to everything also, in addition to Hexaorb's skill. We have here 4 copies of just the normal heal triggers. You're more than welcome to play any of the effect heals if you'd like. That's up to you. My general policy when it comes to these effect heals now is that I'll play it in decks where I can very easily draw out a lot of cards, because then I will have a higher chance of getting them when I need to for that specific matchup, because I tend to always go 2-2. So considering Hexaorb can manipulate her stack, you can possibly see the heals, and if there's a specific heal that you need, you can make sure that you trigger that instead, so you can then use it to guard next turn. But again, that's up to you. Finally, we of course have the overtrigger here. You kind of do need to play the Keter Sanctuary overtrigger. This is the only version that we have of it. Of course, this is an alternate art version of it, but it has the effect where if this is drive checked until the end of the turn, all of your units can perform drive check. So the reason why this is really good for Hexaorb is that it gives you a lot of hand value, and since you can always make sure that this happens, you can make sure your overtrigger goes off because of the fact that you will be manipulating the top cards of your deck. If you end up using the Obaria, it's kind of irrelevant because you can only really usually give power to 2 rear guards, so you're just going to give 2 rear guards 100 million power, not make use of the Hexaorb skill, and not be able to draw as many cards either. I guess there might be an argument always. There's usually always an argument for Obara, and it's usually me that's bringing it up. But I'm saying that this is probably the better overtrigger for this deck. So let's go ahead and do a test play here. I have myself this hand before Mulligan. What you want to do, of course, is get rid of any triggers because you want to be checking them and not really having them in hand. Unfortunately, we're going to go ahead and draw the overtrigger as well as a crit, which is quite unfortunate. It is not the worst thing in the world. You can possibly get the Octoray to put this on the bottom of the deck, which we have here, and it might have some value in playing stuff like Tortoise or Drilling Angel, just because you can then put stuff like that on the bottom of your deck, shuffle it. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and stand up our Vanguard here. Ideally, what we want for starting hand is Persona Ride is nice, Octoray is nice. Owen, we don't really want to see until later on because he's not useful until turn 3. Octoray is fine, but it's the same deal. If you can get a Quadrocrest, that's kind of nice, as well as a Little Sage Marin, so we can try and get some rush, but we don't have any of that at the moment. So we're going to draw into, of course, Little Sage Marin here. Depending on if we're going first or second here, I will go ahead and for now, let's go ahead and discard the Owen. I try to keep the triggers in hand because I try to keep the damage to a minimum, as well as have something for Hexaorb in case I just don't see anything later on. We're going to go ahead and take our damage here. It's going to be a Hexaorb Sorceress and draw for turn. It's going to be another critical trigger, which I guess we will get rid of now to go into our... That's not what we want to go into. We want to go into Pentaclaim Sorceress here. We're going to go ahead and counterblast the damage we just took to draw a card, which is unfortunately going to be yet another heal, but that's just how it be. Here you have some options. Your opponent's going to be on grade 1 on the impression that we went first, so you can play the Marin here. She's still only going to be 8k, but you can also just put it here to give yourself a slightly stronger power on the Vanguard, and you will also set up for next turn. We're going to go ahead and check and get the glow, which is kind of nice. Let's go ahead and take some damage here. Crit to our Vanguard here. We'll no guard and survive just fine as we stand up our Vanguard, draw into another Hexaorb Sorceress. We have a couple of plays that we can do here. We can discard the Hexaorb Sorceress or even ride into her if we'd like to, and then try and use the Octoray here to get rid of the overtrigger here. We can also discard the heal and keep the Persona Rides. Judging from this hand, I don't know how likely that'll be that I'll be able to last very long. Let's say we do that. We discard the Persona Ride, go into Hexaorb Sorceress, use Pentagleam's skill to look at the top 3. We unfortunately have nothing useful there, so we'll just put that back in the top of the deck. We can go ahead and use Quadroclass here to counterblast 1. Look at the top 2 cards of our deck here. We'll add them to our hand, and we'll take this overtrigger and we're going to go ahead and put that in the bottom of the deck. And let's go ahead and throw out the four-side glow sorceress, and you can go ahead and fill up your board. Depending, of course, on the matchup, if it's something that is going to blow up your board like Barrow or Gravidia, do not. Otherwise, just go whole hog. You want as much power as you want. You don't have to go for the Lalarita. We don't have the counterblast for it at the moment, but you don't always have to go for the Lalarita. So it can just be a nice booster. So let's just go ahead and swing in here. 23k. Usually your opponents will end up PGing this because the math is too hard to try and figure out how to guard this and then whether or not you pull power somewhere else. We're going to check a first Lalarita and then check again and actually get the critical trigger. So you can actually use it to give however you want to distribute it depending on what you've seen in your opponent's hand and how they've been guarding. But let's just say we do a split here since we gave the power from the Hexaorb skill here. We can use the skill of Foreglow to Soul Blast 2 and countercharge 1, and then also draw a card, which is fortunately going to be another critical trigger. Which is another thing to keep in mind, but we do have a lot of things to guard with here. We can go ahead and swing in with some nice hefty attacks. This is going to be a nice 28. This is here a nice 30, which is very good. Afterwards, if you'd like, you can go ahead and intercept with the Octoray. She's not super useful. She is useful for the Persona Ride skill, but often you can only really use 2 front and rear guards, so I end up having to have like a full board of grade 2, so don't be afraid to intercept. But we can go ahead and guard like crazy here for our opponent's clapback as we take some damage, get a heal trigger. I don't know if we'll heal, but either way, we can then stand our Vanguard here, and we're in a pretty good spot to have a really strong turn here as we draw, go into a Persona Ride, draw for the Persona Ride. Oof, that is actually quite perfect here. So we have a couple of things we can do here. I can get rid of the Octaway, go into the Owen, and we can go ahead and use the skill of the Owen to Soul Blast 1. Look at the top 2 cards of our deck here. Not the best cards, so let's go ahead and put that at the bottom here. We could have also not used the Owen and gone for the Lalarita. Again, that is up to you. I think it's more beneficial to try and get the triple drive here, so we'll Soul Blast, Counter Blast here, and put the trigger on top, so we can make sure we hit the crit. I'm going for triple drive, and we'll go in first here, because we do have the fronts, but we don't actually have any way to restand this. We got ourselves a huge 33k swing here with a trigger. For your opponent to be able to guard this, they're going to have at least guard for 53, because I can very easily check the critical trigger here, give the crit here, and give the power here to Hexaorb, and then give the power from Hexaorb's skill to Marin, making this 53k. And that's really hard to guard, especially considering that if you guard over 53, that's only a 1 to pass, or sorry, a 2 to pass, and I still have more drive checks coming. I can also very easily just get the power here. So we can go ahead and check the critical trigger here, depending on how they'll guard, we can distribute the power, check the front trigger, get the power there, and then check yet another front trigger. We can very easily also use the Owen skill to then use the skill to power him up, making it a very huge rear guard, which if we wanted to, we could have used the skill Lalarita instead of the Hexaorb skill. I managed to get lucky and hit the triggers, and then we can have him restand. And that's generally how the deck goes. You just have to keep track of your resources, as well as using your triggers as resources, because you will eventually run out of these late game. So you have to try and end the game rather quickly, which is why cards like Marin are really good, because you get the early rush that you can do with her, as well as late game, or him, that you can do with him late game, where you can use them to boost Hexaorb, which just give you really strong columns, or if this gets retired or whatever the case may be, you can still use that for the pressure. So I think Marin is one of the best cards for this deck. But yeah, that'll do it for that sample play. Alright, that'll do it for Hexaorb Sorceress. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. It's a very simple build. It doesn't do anything too crazy. You do have a lot of options, both in terms of what you can play in the deck, but also in terms of like what you can do. There's a bunch of different routes depending on the cards you have in hand, what you're facing, so on and so forth. So it is a somewhat versatile build. But of course, it just has all these common downfalls of Hexaorb Sorceress, that she needs lots of resources. You have to have triggers. There's nowhere to put triggers back. You can't like Legion. So if you run out of triggers, you're shit out of luck. If you draw into all your triggers, you're shit out of luck for the most part. You have to be very careful with your soul and your counter blast, and be careful trying to get soul, because you can end up losing one of the precious pieces that you need. Other than that, I think the deck is really good, has a lot of explosive power, and hopefully she gets something to make her a little bit more consistent in the future. Till next time, take care of yourself, play Vanguard, and have yourself a damn good one.